Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Today we're joined again by Steve Birkett, the host of Plug and Play EV. He recently embarked on an incredible 8,500-mile road trip across the U.S. in his electric vehicle. Steve shares his highs and lows of the journey, offering insights in the current state of EV travel and what he hopes will improve in the future. Whether you're an EV enthusiast or just curious about what it's like to hit the road in an electric vehicle, this episode has something for everyone. Also, for those listening and in the San Francisco Bay Area, I will be hosting the Amazon Recharge Zone at Electrify Expo in San Francisco this weekend, August 24th and 25th. If you'll be attending or are in the Bay Area and want to meet up to talk about electric vehicles or anything grid related, hit me up. You can either tweet at us on our social pages or leave a comment on YouTube for this episode, or even email me at chase@connectingthegrid.com. That's chase@connectingthegrid.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with at least one other person who might find it interesting as well. And don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your support helps us continue bringing you great content. With that, enjoy. I'm joined by Steve Birkett again from Plug and Play EV. Thanks again for coming on today, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again.
Yeah, I've just always been enjoying the, fortnightly live episodes you've been doing with the rest of the Coast to Coast EV team on YouTube. And I definitely recommend anyone that hasn't been watching those to check them out. I'll definitely make sure to have a link in today's show notes. But we were just kind of chatting, one, about being on an upcoming episode. And unfortunately, I just haven't done many road trips this year. It's been pretty kind of a couple hundred miles or something, just point to point. So I really haven't had to use public fast charging. And so you took quite the trip recently. And I think it'd be really interesting to just talk about your EV road trip and your experience on today's episode and kind of let that guide us. And I think it'll be really informational and interesting to our listeners, especially too.
For sure, yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to share. I've been a long time EV owner, as spoken about in the past, almost a decade now, but I've never done a coast-to-coast trip. And, coming from the UK, which is probably the size of some states in many cases, it's kind of a new thing to think about going across a country and, driving thousands of miles and still not running out of land. So that had been on my radar for a long time. I got pretty close to it in the Bolt EV days, going down to Austin, Texas from Boston to fully charge live in 2020, but that was not quite reaching the other coast. So this year decided to make the most of the last year of free Electrify America charging, head across to we started actually in the easternmost point of the lower 48 states up in Maine, in a place called West Quoddy Head, which has a lighthouse, as you would expect from scenic coastal Maine. And then headed across the country by various national parks to the technically the northwesternmost point, not quite the westernmost, but a place called Cape Flattery in Washington State. So I think headline numbers were around just over 8,500 miles, covered 23 states. And overall efficiency for the nerds out there was 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour, which is not
Nice.
great until you consider you're doing 80 plus miles an hour in some of those plain states. So it gets pretty heavy on the aero at that point.
Well, I was going to ask you, when you road trip, how do you drive? Because I usually do anywhere from 5 to 10 over through a lot of these. So
is my guideline. Although once you get to 80 miles an hour, it's only really the bulldozer trucks in the left lane that are cranking out that. It was pretty comfortable to just stay at 80, 82 at that point. But anything in the kind of 70, 75 miles an hour speed limit zones is just. Although I think people are driving crazier since the end of the pandemic. It definitely seems to be a little more wild out there, whether you're in the coast or kind of in the middle of the country. There seem to be those speedsters going no matter what the situation.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that too. I have driven I-80 especially quite a bit, and then also I-90. But I'm kind of curious on your trip. Can you share what? I guess let's start with the coast, and then maybe because you didn't take the same way back as you did across the country, right? You did kind of do a little bit of a different.
I hate doubling back on myself along the same route. It's always, if I can do some kind of weird loop, it's always my principally do that. I'm the same flying. I can't fly back over myself and go the same route. Just messes with my head. So we started in Maine, so as I say, coastal Maine. So you're on the kind of scenic Route 1 there. I won't remember all the highways or the interstates as we go across, but we had to drop it off in Pennsylvania, so we did the usual kind of northeast to Midwest route, I-80 or I-84 down through I-80 through Ohio. So that's all fairly familiar stomping grounds for anyone who watches Plug-and-Play V. We've got family over in Ohio, so we did that quite a lot. And then kind of moved on to relatively new states to us through Iowa, South Dakota, did the Badlands over there, so all your I-80 kind of routes, and snuck in a corner of Wyoming to just say we'd been there and show what a charging desert it was in the northeast corner, I guess. Then headed through, get this right, Montana, this tiny sliver of Idaho, which I guess is Panhandle, goes north, and then into Washington State. But we came back, or I came back because my wife kind of bailed out in South Dakota. She'd had enough. But she also had to be back for an event in Pennsylvania. I came back through your neck of the woods, which apologies again for not giving you a call. Didn't realize you were
No worries. I just moved, so I know. Yeah, I figured you're no worries at all.
Yeah, kind of northern Oregon, I guess, with the Columbia River Gorge, as you're familiar with. Then back through the main bit of Idaho, so through Boise, down through Utah, Colorado, and then again more familiar stomping grounds because I used to live in Colorado for a little bit. We've done that Kansas, Missouri kind of route. So yeah, 23 states, kind of I-80, I-90 cross-country routes for the most part, I-70 a little bit as well. And yeah, it's all one big blur at the moment. Just a lot of great interstate.
I'm sure, just coming back from all of that. But I'm curious. So, were there any kind of rules, or because it sounds like this was more of a leisurely trip, but were you trying to do just DC fast charging, or were you like looking for hotels especially that you would stay overnight at to use level 2, or any sorts of hacks or kind of tips to how you were doing this cross country trip, or you were just kind of focused on speed or enjoyment? It sounds more like enjoyment.
On the way across, it was enjoyment. I was with my wife, and we took a lot of time out to. We did some kind of boondocking camping, but we're not hardcore campers. We did maybe 3 days max, and then we had a hotel break. So,
Yeah.
we had a chance to get a nice warm shower and do our laundry in an actually wonderful place that I highly recommend to folks called, I think it was the Bavarian Inn in Custer, South Dakota. Lots of really nice facilities, EV charging, Tesla, J1772, all the kind of mod cons for EV drivers. So that was a highlight, but actually I really didn't practice what I preach on this, not through want of trying, but we've started to identify on Coast to Coast EVs, there is a bit of a lack of accessible hotel charging. I did about 8 of the 16 days camping. A couple of the days were at home or with family, and then the 5 hotel nights, only one of them had EV charging. That was the one that I mentioned, that Bavarian Inn. Not through really, lack of trying. I did look at the places we were going to stop. I planned at least 2 more of those hotel nights. A couple of them were just winging it, so I took it where I could. But instead of getting the level 2 charging, because it just wasn't really out there in the places we visited, I had to kind of fall back on the other side of things where you get near to a fast charger, right? So you arrive with whatever state of charge and then either go there late at night or more likely, as I did in the morning, grab breakfast for my wife and charge at the same time. So I mean that works okay, but I did realize over the 60 or so fast charging sessions we had, we could cut out 4 or 5 of those by just being able to find a hotel that had a level 2. And it's just not really that common, or if it's if it's there, it's in a place where it's going to be iced. If you're doing this in a city, quite often that it just looks more trouble than it's worth, and you don't want to plan your charging around a place that is almost certainly going to be a hassle, especially when you're arriving in, as we did at 11:30 p.m. and just want to hit the sec.
Fair. I guess that brings up a couple other questions. So you mentioned you camped a couple of nights. Were these was this kind of more like dispersed camping, or were any of these like official campgrounds where you could actually like plug into an RV plug-in?
A good mix, actually. One of the best ones was Ledges State Park. You tend to find the state parks and the ones that are run that way have electric hookups. So we've done that a couple of times over the years. So the place in Iowa, Ledges State Park, was definitely a good one for plugging in. just a minor plug, but we use the J plus, so I guess J2 booster. It's kind of got all the adapters, on the end. You can take the pigtails off and use it for the TT30 camping adapters, and we use EMA 1450, but there's a bunch that you can use. A nice little product to kind of, be able to adapt to whatever campsite has. But a lot of them were either the dispersed camping or just places that had the RV. A lot of these are in RV places where you can get that slot, but you don't necessarily want to be with the RVs. You got the kind of tent
For
and
sure.
the small car in between all the massive rigs. Doesn't always work that way. So a lot of it was actually, just kind of regular campsites without the electric hookup. Just enjoying really. Actually, then the power kind of reverses because you're using the cars. The Arctic 5 has the V2L feature, and we took a portable power bank, so we were able to kind of just make breakfast, use the car's features.
Nice.
So you're using the car to kind of power the battery, and then the battery goes around the campsite wherever it's most needed to kind of cook or power devices, or in some cases just using right out the car to plug into the various kind of induction hob or the kettle for a nice morning cup of tea. But yeah, it was a lot of camping, but not really a whole lot of opportunity to charge. So again, that was planning in the fast charge before you stop, so that you're at 80%, and then typically we don't really use more than 10 to 20% of the battery pack in the Ioniq 5 itself. It kind of does enough to kind of power your devices and get that cooking done, but it's it's nice to be able to wake up to a full charge, obviously, and that happened less than I would have expected it to be able to happen on this trip.
Well, I was kind of curious because I haven't heard much about it this year, but I remember last year when I was doing a trip, there were a couple of campsites I was looking at, and it just seemed like I was seeing a lot of things posted online that campsites were, if they did offer like RV charging, they were now trying to either ban or like charge more specifically for EVs because there were concerns that they use more electricity or would throw the breakers, which I could definitely understand. I have used a friend's RV charger that they have at their home when I've gone there to stay because it's in a bit of a remote area. But we've had to, and I don't know if you can do, I think you can do this in the Ioniq. You can turn down the AC amperage. And that's what we found is if we just brought it down, it was still more than just plug into a regular wall outlet. But then it wouldn't throw the breaker. And so I'd heard quite a few last year, like campgrounds were starting to push back on EVs. And I'm just kind of curious if you've heard more about that or came across that at all in your trip. It doesn't sound like it.
No, so I mean, obviously the only one, as I say, that we really got to charge at was this one in Iowa, and I don't think that they've quite reached the level of adoption where people are constantly plugging in and tripping their breakers. But we did hit a couple with the kids last year when we traveled, which were more family-oriented sites, heavier volume, that had specifically no EV charging from these outlets. A lot of COAs or the kind of name brand campsites that you see. But where they've obviously had a problem in the past, something has kind of triggered them to put up these signs, and I think some of them are in the process of figuring out how to best to have EV charging, whether it's a central point where you can go and park your car, it works okay, but we did some car camping as well, so the car becomes your tent because it's inclement weather, or you just arrive late and it's more convenient to not set the tent up.
Right.
And that becomes, you can't really then drive off and camp by the charger because that's kind of in the middle of the campsite and defeats the entire point of having your own little berth. So no, nothing specific this time. They certainly didn't have any problem at the place in Iowa that we went to, but I can see that becoming more and more of a thing as you get into these areas where camping and being able to charge your car is quite a bonus. I can see more and more draw being put on those circuits. As you say, as long as your car can dial back that amperage and be a little on the safer side, I think you're fine, but there's definitely going to be some people just plugging it in, hoping it works, and maybe waking up in the middle of the night with a power outage.
Well, so that's really interesting to hear that you did come across that last year, but not on this trip. And let's talk about then the level 2. What in your opinion was it just kind of challenges with planning and just the places you were going to find level 2 charging at these hotels, or were there any reasons in particular you think that these areas were more of a desert than others?
Well, I think in the middle the States, as you get to the plains and the kind of the high deserts there, it definitely becomes just a lack of hotels in general. There's only so many of them, and then you have,
Yeah,
it then becomes there's not that many with the foresight to put in level 2 charging. I think there's certainly more around the routes we've gone in the New York, New England region, but again, they tend to
for
be
sure.
quite, as Tesla led this, as you know, with the destination charger program, that tends to be at higher end resorts. Uh, B&Bs, guest houses, that kind of thing, which we do from time to time, but for the majority of really like on a longer trip, we'll usually do a mix of camping and mid-level hotels. So in the East, it hasn't been as much of a problem to find that charging, although you do have to book it ahead of time. But when I was looking on the spot, and even in Indiana, which was just like a stop off after dropping off the kids, just an easy way to get a good drive day in and then stop around Indianapolis, just couldn't find anything that was conveniently placed around that kind of east side of Indy. That was a good option to charge. Again, maybe people will weigh in the comments with a million different options that I missed.
Right.
But I've done this for a few years, and most of the settings on PlugShare or ChargePoint figured out, and just couldn't find anywhere that was that good of a fit. And then in the middle of the country, as I say, it just becomes more and more sparse in terms of who offers EV charging, unless it's a NEMA 1450 at an RV site.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because the road trip I've done, and admittedly the furthest east it's been to is Iowa, and just barely Iowa. I was also road tripping to cover distance and not really like to enjoy it. So I was able to find hotels that I could like strategically. I was like, okay, at this point I could stay here for the night, and they have level 2. It's a high enough plug share square. I don't have to worry about it. But it definitely does seem a little bit like if you're trying to do a trip for enjoyment or a little bit more spontaneously, then yeah, you're more likely than not going to just have to deal with getting up early or before you go to the hotel and charging with a supercharger or at a DC fast charger, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's an opportunity there to. We've heard about the deals with Tesla charging and some of the hotel chains. I certainly have a couple of chains that I know in the Northeast would be regularly offering charging, but as a nationwide franchise or brand, I don't know of anybody. There's not really a go-to who I would say that chain I know is going to offer EV charging. And obviously, none of this really takes into account stuff like Airbnbs, vacation rentals by owner. So maybe there's an entire wing there that I just didn't look at, and maybe people can use that as more of a travel hack to have a secondary or tertiary option. But the
Right.
hotels, which again, it's just easier to roll up, check in, be gone the next morning. Known quantity kind of thing. None of them were a known quantity for EV charging or something. I could say, hey, there's a XYZ brand. I know there's going to be 2 or 3, level 2 chargers that I can just rely on.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I think it's totally true about it being more coastal because I know I usually will go with Hilton, especially if I'm kind of on coast. Just there's a very high likelihood they usually have level 2, and it's same with Marriott. But I've just usually used Hilton more from personal travel, and so with when you're traveling, you mentioned the when you use has come an adapter. Do you have an adapter for the Tesla charger to use with your Ionic to charge at these level 2 as well?
Yeah, all the
Yeah.
places I want actually had J1772, but I usually
Oh,
travel with
okay,
the
good.
Electron, just
Yeah.
the type of kind of handle easily to just throw in the frunk, even though the Ionic Flash frunk is minuscule. It's big enough to carry a portable charge cord and a few different adapters.
Kind of what
So
you
do
need.
use the Juice J2 boost. I'm trying to think what else we had in there. The V2L adapter, that's about the size of a regular just Tesla adapter, so that's in the front as well. Then a 12-volt battery booster just in case. I had one incident last year, thankfully on a relatively local trip, where the battery kept dying and we had the 12-volt drain issue, but that's all in the past. Thankfully, haven't needed it since.
That's good. I guess, just before we get into the fast charging side of stuff, I'm kind of curious, maybe to take a step back. When you were doing this trip, was there? You mentioned you having those charge cables, and it sounds like you always have those in your car in the front there, and I kind of do the same thing. But I think maybe to people listening who haven't done a big road trip in an EV, is there any kind of planning or specific things you make sure to pack with you how do you go about your road tripping? Because I'm kind of curious. Because when I know I'm going to do like a couple 1,000 mile thing, like I have it. I'm not focused on sometimes fun. I'm focused on like, okay, I've got the tire repair kit. I got this. I got like just to make sure I get the miles done. And I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious to hear if that plays into you or how you approach this road trip and road
So the
trips in
car
general.
is 3 years old. So we've already, we've done this on the hard yards over what was missing in the first year.
Yeah,
That we
yeah.
slowly filled in the trunk and the trunk. Not really. I mean, the camp by virtue of camping, you take a lot of stuff with you. So we have, a lot of chairs, tents, pillows, comfort stuff. All of the chargers are in the front anyway now, locally as well as going on, cross country trips. So I don't have to think too much about that. Really, I guess just the usual stuff of, making sure your tires are inflated. We definitely need to change the tires now, but before it, they were in pretty good condition. Uh, and the usual checks. We do have a local shop here that does a pretty good job of doing the once over of EVs, an independent shop. But obviously, you can go to your dealership and just get them to rotate the tires, make sure you're in good shape before you head off on several thousand miles worth of trip.
No, that's great. So let's get to the interesting side of stuff. I think that gets all the headlines anyway. Even though this is kind of the example and the time you need DC fast charging, which is on that big road trip. So what? Let's start from the beginning and kind of hear what your experience was as you took this trip with using fast chargers and any of the different CPOs in particular that seem to give you good and pros and cons.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of biased on this one because, as I say, we were on the Electrify America free charging plan. This is our last kind of few months of complimentary 30-minute sessions, which the Army pretty much gets the charging done within that period. So we did about 76% of the sessions on Electrify America, which is
Wow.
just the way it is. That's what we're looking at. There also are, just as the nationwide provider, if you look at the maps, they're the only one that truly does the kind of coast-to-coast routes outside of Tesla superchargers. So you can probably get across the country on a mix of other CPOs, but they were the ones that we kind of went with for both, financial and just ease of access. But there were gaps. I tried to make sure, just as a channel, I tried to compare and contrast what the other CPOs are doing, where the presence are of different providers, and then obviously you've got regional ones that I've never even come across until this trip. So stuff like Francis Energy, 24/7 travel centers in Kansas. Just a bunch of the whole Volvo Starbucks partnership that goes down from Seattle to, I think, Denver, Colorado. That was just one that you don't come across in the West. You obviously have ChargePoint, whose equipment they use, but that was one that kind of constantly popped up again and again when I was on that kind of route from your kind of region down to Denver, where there was always an option. It wasn't always the fastest option, alongside Electrify America. It was maybe a best 200 kilowatt, but again, that's not a bad piece of kit if you're looking for a place where you want to just change it up, because as the old stereotype goes, Electrify America is full of Walmarts, and it's not
Right.
a common kind of thing to be at either a Walmart or a gas station. Starbucks provides kind of an interesting alternative when you're going along that kind of route. But yeah, it was mostly Electrify America who, for the most part, did pretty good. It's there's a lot of new installations across that Plains area because they were kind of second, third wave for Electrify America. A lot of the routes they tried to bridge initially were that I-70 route for the cross country, and I think it's I-40 further south, which I didn't cover. But those were their first, where they were throwing in a lot of this equipment, which has initially proven to be a problem. You've got some of that older Signet hardware and some of the providers who they're now ripping out and replacing with latest generation hardware. Whereas in the Plains, this is just they weren't covered, so they just learned the lessons elsewhere and implanted their newer hardware into those locations. So some of these were 6-stall Electrify Americas, which for them is a step up of over the previous 3 or 4 stall installations. New hardware. A lot of these places had pull-through stalls, which was valuable. You start to see a lot of people towing as you hit that middle of the country, Wisconsin, Great Lakes kind of area, into Iowa and the Plains, where people are going to the national parks. They're towing their big rigs, and not that I saw any Cybertrucks or F-150 Lightnings in that particular area, but if they were using that, they would have had pull-through stalls. So a lot of EA, ChargePoint was second, although that's more just ubiquity of, ChargePoint as a business model is pretty much going into a lot of towns and government sites, a lot of dealerships, that kind of thing. Um, a couple of pilot flying J's, they kind of disappear in the middle of the country, certainly in the
Right.
north, and then reappear in the kind of Idaho, Washington area. Um, and yeah, just some regional providers as well. Francis Energy did actually quite well. I've heard horror stories of them from some of the older installations, and folks like Jacob Espinoza down in New Mexico. They have a lot of Francis Energy down there, and he's just constantly complaining about their older kit. But it was interesting to see as I hit all these Electrify Americas and looked at PlugShare what other options were out there. And surprisingly, other than the middle states where there's just a lack of fast charging, there were some really interesting options for most of the journey. Whether it was the Starbucks Volvo kind of partnership with ChargePoint, Circle K had a presence a lot in Illinois, kind of the middle of the country, then back in Washington. Trying to think, well, Rivian, who we're just waiting and watching for them to open up the network. I wasn't even really looking for them; just kind of stumbled across them a couple of times. And then occasionally Tesla superchargers, which the Ioniq 5 don't really do much, but the Magic Dock locations were in places like Ames, Iowa, and, Forks, Washington. So there's some places where they would have been potentially useful if I was needing to charge.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess one other question would be, what was like the weather during this trip? Because I know when I was coming back through I-90 on the last trip, I was facing just a horrendous headwind, and I pretty much had to charge at every station, unfortunately. But yeah, I'd just be curious to hear if there was anything like that you came across.
Heat more than anything
Yeah.
else. It was still, we had a heat wave in Boston. This was mostly end of July, early August. And we had a heat wave throughout the Northeast, kind of towards the middle of July, and that continued, just kind of followed us across the country. So while we were hearing, Ohio and the East Coast being battered by the various hurricanes that were, making their way up the coast, we were just in the middle of a blazing heat wave. So again, along that Columbia River Gorge, I actually started kind of, in that Oregon, Portland, Washington kind of border area. The temperatures were maybe mid-50s. It was pretty chilly at that point. But then going up into the kind of desert parts, I think I charged in Hermiston, one of the convenience stores there, no shelter. That was one of the lacking things, not a whole lot of canopies or shelter. But the equipment's just baking in the sun. It's so hot. And you do start to get a little thermal throttling at that point. It wasn't too often, but we definitely felt the pumping the air conditioning the entire way, because that was just blazing heat for a lot of it.
Yeah, that's something worth talking about. I actually had a friend, as we were kind of mentioning right before this, he was texting me this week, and I think it was up to Washington. And it was decently warm, but yeah, he kept texting me like, well, it's a rental. Is this the issue I'm having? Is it the car? Is it the charger? And it just seemed like since he was having this consistently at the he would move chargers, and so it seemed more and more like it was charger specific and probably heat related. Was that something you were seeing, or was it more maybe a little bit of the car, a little bit of both, or what were some of the challenges you saw around that?
Yeah, more in terms of energy draw. We don't get that hot over here. It's probably similar for you if you're near the coast. Those coastal regions tend to hit 80s, 90s, and that's boiling hot for us. But in the middle, it was getting much closer to 100, 110 in some places, and that's where it starts to just drag on AC. Recurrent does some really good studies of this. I think they're in your area, but you don't really hit that heat wall until the mid 90s, hitting 100. But folks in Arizona, Nevada, the desert parts of California will definitely be familiar with how much that heat starts to drain. Because we hear all the time about winter and using the heating system. It really drains the kind of efficiency and range, but it does tend to hit as you get up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and above. Charging wise, it wasn't that much of an issue. We pretty much were in and out at most charging sessions with 20-25 minutes.
Nice.
So occasionally it'll throttle back at 70-80% mark, but by that point you're pretty much done. More often than not, we were waiting. Well, the car was waiting, ready and done. We were waiting in the store to fill up supplies, and go grab dinner, whatever. The car was ready typically before we were.
And I've found that to be generally the case, especially when you're traveling with someone else, that And then if you have kids or a dog, it's always everyone else is waiting on someone else versus the actual car during the trip.
Yeah, I mean, this is only the two. We have two other kids, so when we travel as a family, it's definitely slow. The car is just never the crunch point. There's a little shorter stops for me and my wife, but we're still, when you're camping, you tend to have the next eye on where the campsite is and what you need to prepare in the evening. So unless you're on one of those hotel nights, you need to pick up. You're glad to get to a grocery store because you need to pick up the fresh produce, more ice, the cooler. So a bunch of stuff that is kind of a daily pickup. So at least one or two of the stops were valuable just to kind of resupply and get ready for the campsite that night.
That's great. Now, and it sounds like overall the biggest struggle you had with your trip was really just the middle of the country, which I don't think is too surprising for most people. Definitely not impossible, obviously, but that is just where it probably required a little bit more of just being aware of where the chargers were. And would you say that's pretty accurate?
Hugely uneventful on the way across.
Yeah.
I mean, it was much smoother. Even I know this stuff inside out after this point, but there's really no sticking points. The only place where there was a gap in slower charging was that Wyoming. Wyoming's becoming pretty.
Wyoming's a challenge just in general.
Wyoming and Florida are both the kind of Florida for different reasons, but the kind of politically motivated leanings are starting to crunch on some of the EV infrastructure in those states from a federal funding point of view, at least. But Wyoming was the only place where we had to. I used a Stellantis dealership of all things, but they don't really have any EVs, but they had an EV charger. So a little gap where it was about 220 miles from the EA in Gillette to wherever it was in Montana and Billings, I would guess. There's a little town called Sheridan, which it must be a small place because it has a 4-stall, 150 kilowatt V2 Tesla supercharger, so you know when you start 4-stall that it's not the kind of oasis of EV charging, but that was just a regular old ChargePoint CPE 250. So we were sitting there waiting. I waited initially for a Volvo XC40 recharge for about 10 minutes, and then got on a 62.5 kilowatt charger. That was probably my longest charge session. I would bet it was about 50 minutes, but that was the only place where there was a charging desert, I would say, on the way across. And then the way back, we definitely hit some more glitchy older EA stations in the kind of Kansas City, Missouri side. And that's when I just kind of bailed and went to dealership charging at that point, which actually was another point of the trip that was quite notable. Ford Charge especially, I would call out for having really good installs, good site design, lots of stalls, mostly high power stations that maxed out the Ioniq 5. Just wasn't really expecting it. As I go out, I'm expecting maybe Pilot K or Circle K to kind of step in as backup. And Ford Charge, certainly in my area, but also across the country, really seems to be doing a really good job of getting in the right equipment and providing places where you're not going to be blocked by dealer inventory or trying to weave between the trucks to find space to charge your car.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Is I mean, I haven't used a dealership one since like the early days, and back then they were much slower and usually just level 2 or something, and maybe a couple of Chathamos. But in your experience, it sounds like these have been really good lately. Is there ever the awkward, like, oh, I'm showing up in my Ioniq at a Ford dealership, it's out of the way, or what was just share that with us as someone who owns something that's a different brand. It sounds like it's been positive.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would call out Ford for actually installing stuff that can charge a car quickly and is multiple stalls with several dispensers, but you're paying for the service now. It used to be a case where you maybe I remember the bad old days in the Chevy dealerships that are at 25 kilowatts on Bosch units where you're really fighting it's a free charge. They're on the upside really because you're waiting at the dealership for hours. But no, they were all clear everywhere. I looked, sense checked them on PlugShare so you have a feel for whether or not it's a friendly place, but the middle of the country was, really good for those kind of dealerships, which are just some of them had squeegees and, the usual kind of gas station amenities, bins, that kind of thing. So yeah, it was just it's as you say, you kind of slip out of the dealership charging and kind of dismissed that in the last year or two as the old days of charging when you really just had to. Yeah. But nowadays it was not that I would make a beeline for a dealership charge, but some of them have they're in town centers. They brought business to their communities, essentially, because, we were there charging, and whilst we were doing that, we looked at, local restaurants, local grocery stores, just somewhere to walk around and have a shop. So it was an interesting kind of juxtaposition with, actual charging networks that are trying to facilitate, interstate travel and cross-country travel, with just local community kind of businesses that, have either hopefully put it in, intentionally, or had their hand forward when they were
Yeah.
in the days of their monthly rollout.
Yeah, so that's that actually brings up another interesting question. When I go on EV road trips, I always a part of it I really do enjoy, even though usually when I'm doing these long ones, I'm kind of in the zone. I always have really interesting conversations with people also at chargers, or probably more commonly, I just have people, especially in the middle of the country, I would just have people walk up to me and say, like, "Is that thing electric?" Or have these kinds of not negative, but just you could say like, oh, these things actually exist, or and
Mm.
maybe this is becoming less and less of a thing. But I'm kind of curious. First, were there any? Because I've had some interesting, not I would say inherently negative, but I have had some interesting experiences lately with dealerships around EVs. So I'd be curious if you've had any conversations like that around EVs at dealerships when you've charged, but then also just this road trip in general.
Mm. Um, again, I don't really try and charge in dealerships before.
Yeah.
There's
Okay.
some this handy kind of overlap. I've almost ignored them for the past year or two, other than the ones locally, which just kind of check out. I didn't interact with a whole lot of the dealership staff per se. The one in Wyoming was a really nice, place. Just, I think it's still more of a curiosity that people are
Right.
stopping with them, because, again, Stellantis just isn't this big EV brand yet, so they're still on that kind of cusp of seeing EVs. But they were definitely kind of eyeballing, looking at the cars as we went by. And then the locals, the most common question is, how long does it take to charge? It's just the kind of thing. And so with the Arctic 5, that's quite a good conversation, because I'm usually gone within, 20, 25 minutes. They can kind of see it because they've been hanging around for the same period of time, that, that actually would fit at least how they refuel. Whether or not it goes far enough for them is another
For sure.
question. Again, I don't know too many people that can drive 300, 400 miles in a sitting without stopping for some kind of break. So mostly around, recharge times, and most of them were at least positive conversations, if not a little bit kind of, just what is it, how does
Yeah.
it, how do you get here from Massachusetts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've ever had like a negative thing. It's usually just kind of general curiosity and like
Yeah,
skepticism. And
yeah,
yeah,
I haven't heard too much. I'm expecting a little more, actually, as you leave the kind of the coffee states that you know and love, that you go out into these areas where, there may be an element of hostility, but I don't think, although the Ioniq 5 is distinctive, it doesn't really scream EV. It doesn't have a lot of,
true.
some Massachusetts EVs have kind of, like, stuff all over them, and just wasn't the case on this trip. So it doesn't shout it out, but certainly there are people who were, intrigued that it could get that far when they'd written the stuff off as a city car.
Oh, for sure. And I think that you bring up a couple interesting things there. One, yeah, I've never had like a negative thing. It's more like, oh, so it doesn't, it's like more like kind of curiosity. And it's like, oh, so it doesn't take hours to charge these things.
Right.
And you're like, well, yeah, it does if you're plugged into like a level 2 or an outlet at home. But when you're on a road trip, yeah, you're talking about minutes. And so
Yeah.
that's where it's all. I always kind of see like the light bulb go on above people's minds. Even they're like, well, it might not be for me, but it's good to know that,
Yeah.
or
Well,
not for me just yet, or like I have my dually RAM pickup. But it like you can. It's not like a negative thing. It's always so funny to see like the online Facebook comments and all that stuff versus
yeah,
the
people
reality.
are
I think is like
probably
night
more
and day.
critical when they're on their Facebook posts than they are in,
Maybe.
posts. No, it's interesting. I mean, the whole conversation here, there's an undercurrent of we continue to have to kind of, subsume the benefit of EVs, the home charging or the level 2 charging, because, as you say, if you're talking about how long it takes to charge, for level 2 charging, you'd have to say 10, 12 hours in some cases. But that's the advantage of it. And this is kind of going around I don't know what you're reading on your LinkedIn and your various profiles, but there's a lot of this at the moment. I think there was a Wall Street Journal article on, Americans are missing the point on electric cars. The whole thing here is that you can charge them at home, you have a fueling station in your driveway, but these conversations at the fast chargers they almost do a disservice to this, because you're talking about how fast it charges. That's the mindset, especially at a gas station or convenience store, is how quickly can I get out of there? Whereas more really, how can you cut out this refilling experience altogether for 90% of your driving or more? You know, how can you in your day-to-day life just wake up to a full charge and never think about anything other than plugging in at night and unplugging in the morning?
For sure. And then I think the kind of other side of that I think some of the EV haters always like to kind of disregard, or it's like, oh, that's different, is, and I even had this conversation the other day with my friend. Like, he likes to go to Costco because it's cheaper to fill up gas. And it's really the conversation of kind of large metropolis, inner city kind of gas stations. And yeah, you might be waiting like 20, 15 minutes, especially in the summer on the weekdays around kind of people coming off of work or large holidays. And sure, that can also happen at EV charging stops, but I just find so much more frequently that it's like, I will roll up to a charger, and if there's a gas station there and it's a busy weekend, I'll see like a bunch of people waiting in line, especially if it's like a Costco, to get gas versus just rolling up and plugging in and then going in, using the bathroom, whatever going on.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I think it's totally valid understanding and kind of criticism, but it's also just, you kind of have to take a step back and have that critical thinking and have that like just realistic conversation, and also approach a lot of these people as a person who still drives a gas vehicle occasionally, and who primarily had driven gas vehicles before. They like, yeah, I waited 30 minutes in line to get cheap gas. I will admit that. And it happens, but now I don't have to deal with that, especially since most of the time I just charge at home.
yeah, exactly. It's hard to get the nuances across, because there are those various levels of charging. But once you see it and kind of start to realize that that's available, you know, as long as you have the option at home,
Right,
then
exactly.
it's you know, that's a lot of people, and there's a lot of people who don't necessarily associate it with that benefit.
Totally. And then I can't remember where I read it, and I haven't been able to find it since, but I remember years ago seeing a stat that like someone had done a measurement, and on average in a year, people spent more time at gas stations than they did charging.
Yeah.
And
Well, I've always wanted to kind of put a time lapse on while I charge. Some of these, you know, EA stations are better than others for this, but there's certain places, State College in Sheets jumps out, Sheets in State College, Pennsylvania jumps out at me for some reason, because you get a really clear view of the whole parking lot. I just want to put a time lapse camera on to see like how long these cars stay, because
right.
if you come in and out in 20-25 minutes, there's definitely people where I've pulled in and they've been there and they haven't left before I've, you know, headed out. And that's, you know, it's an overlap with the convenience store becoming a fast food joint as well now. They're much more,
Right.
you know, grab your peanuts and hit the road again. But it's kind of morphing into that, where the dwell time of an EV is not necessarily even, you know, longer than or the same as some of these gas stops, because they stop, they think of a rest area, they stop, they go into the rest area, they, you know, do their bio, they do their convenience store shop, maybe grab some food, then they come out and then they have to do exactly what you say with the active kind of pumping for, you know, 3-4 minutes and paying. So the gas piece is another 5 minutes on top, instead of just a passive thing that you do while you plug in and go and do all that stuff that you were doing in the rest area anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, something I've brought up on this podcast quite a bit, and I just always talk to people about, is like, for technology to take over, it doesn't have to be just as good, it has to be better. And I think with Tesla, and obviously with the plug and charge standard, the fact that you can just plug it in, walk away, creates a better thing instead of having to deal with the terminals. And I'm hoping to see more manufacturers offer that, and really see
Yes.
that
Yeah.
from the ChargePoint operators, because that, especially in a road trip, that does save and add up to a lot of time when
Yeah,
you can just
because I
run.
mean, it can make or break it. You know, if it
Yeah,
starts to
exactly.
they have to unplug and replug, then you're into it. That
Yep.
didn't happen much to me again. There were really very few stall moves, but when it does happen, you're starting to think, all right, well, how people, you know, who see this, that becomes a, why would I ever go to that? Because it looked way harder plugging in the pump and just, you know, pouring the gas.
For sure. And I totally agree with that. But at the same time, it's like, it is such a nice thing when you're on a road trip and you have to use the bathroom so bad, you can just plug it, run, sprint
Yeah,
in
no,
without having to deal with it. That I think, like, once again, using a gas thing, you still have to plug it in, pay it, swipe the card.
yeah,
That
you've done it all
I just
before, right?
love
I mean,
that.
you just, it's a separate activity almost, you know, you
Right.
get the gas as a discrete kind of errand at that point. You have to do it one way or another.
Right. And I mean, I've even rolled up to gas stations and then, yeah, a gas pump or something's out. And so I have to move it. But it's not the same thing that like it stands in your mind as much as when it's at a charging station. And I think just the reality versus the perception is still a challenge in that realm. I'm starting to see that change, but I think that's where still a long ways is to go around trying to um, position that. And I think that's even something I've seen a lot of the dealerships around EVs struggle with, is how to not talk about some of those things that they hear on the news themselves and repeat to people who are even looking at an EV. But I think let's talk about another topic that you had kind of mentioned, especially once you're in the Seattle area, some interesting things that you had kind of ran into, and it was even a meeting with one of a guest of this or a listener of this show and your show as well, that you kind of came across some of the issues in Seattle. And just since we're kind of already on the topic of city charging versus kind of interstate charging.
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out, like, I don't know when this will go out, but I think we have you scheduled for September 11th. Not a great date, but, it's memorable at least. For that one, where we'll be on Coast to Coast TVs talking about charger vandalism, which unfortunately seems to be limited very much to your area. Like, I haven't really seen it around Boston, although we're sometimes a little island away from stuff. Or maybe, New York City or kind of Philly, Pittsburgh would have this kind of challenge, but the only place I've seen it was, fellow viewer Anthony giving me a courtesy of tour around Seattle, and I think there's similar kind of things down into Portland and maybe into parts of California from what I'm reading. But it was, just clipped cords, and this is, across the board. This isn't one network or any one place, so you can kind of easily filter them out. Every site EV goes in underground parking lots, where you'd think that's just a really awkward place to go and try and enter crime with, being on a closed circuit camera. It was actually the first thing I noticed charging in Washington State with Electrify America. They'd put those kind of famous, the thieves that had the Prius, and they've got them on, the camera, closed circuit camera, and now they're broadcasting their pictures all over the internet across. They've put them on the charger screen saying, "Have you seen these people? These are committing the cord-cutting crimes, taking away the ability to charge at a location." But it wasn't, it was everything. And even a pre-opening Tesla supercharger, which is, before post, really great looking site. It's like it's going to be a real boon for the community. Had half its cords clipped.
I saw that.
Over there. And then I think, a couple of people have posted since that the entire thing has been, gutted. And it seems to be a really localized problem to the kind of that part of the West Coast and in certain cities. It was just, heartbreaking to see, really, because city charging is already a bit of a pain. It's definitely that's a common theme across the country, is you're starting to bump up against rideshare drivers, more apartment
For sure.
renters, that kind of thing, tenants, and everybody who's maybe returning vehicles for, rental EVs, that everything kind of collides in these city locations. So, a general takeaway is just try and charge either side of a city, or somewhere where that it's not going to be running into that. But this just compounds that problem, because they're saying some of these sites, as soon as they replace them, they're clipped within a few days. So it's an epidemic at this point in these places, and it really is impacting local EV ownership, because if you see that constantly and they're actually not going to start repairing them because it's just throwing good money after bad, it starts to become a real potential detractor to EV ownership in those locations.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's definitely happened in the Portland area a little bit and kind of sporadically through California, but it really does seem like everything I've heard anecdotally and seen in the news is the Seattle area especially, it just seems to be really bad for that.
Yeah, and people throw out politics, obviously, and, say blue cities, but it really isn't hitting the Chicago's, the East Coast. It's hard. I hope it doesn't. I hope it's not, just starting there and kind of spread. But there's obviously there needs to be some kind of thought around the solution. Maybe we'll have more time to think about in other ways that these kind of things can be combated before we talk again on that September 11th episode. But it was an eye, because I hadn't really considered it. I mean, obviously I heard the reports and you kind of place it in there, well, that's just maybe an isolated site that's getting blasted a few times. But he took me to probably 5 or 6 sites across
Wow.
the board. Tesla, EVgo, Electrify America, all of them just, uniformly kind of hit.
Yeah, and I do know, just coincidentally, it does seem like there has been, trying to not make it political, definitely a lapse in smaller thefts and crimes. And honestly, with only within the last few months, has there been kind of a change in actually like persecuting and kind of like following through with a lot of those criminal punishments and stuff. So hopefully that will continue, especially with this kind of vandalism, to kind of minimize that. But yeah, I mean, it's a fact. It's not one of those things. I think it is something like, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it is happening, and something that I think does need to. I think it's a short-term issue. I think there's been talk of ways they could maybe engineer them better to make them harder to steal. But I think if there's more of a punishment, or like at least follow through for finding people who do this, then it kind of prevents the added costs and the actual like time having to over construct something and just it doesn't happen. So
Yeah, I mean, it's also the juxtaposition of the payoff, which, from what people have said, is, $30 to $40 worth of copper at some of these sites, for the replacement costs of not just the parts, but the technician visit is
for
thousands of
sure.
dollars in its own right. And if that's happening, as you say, multiple times in a month, there's only so many times you're going to do that before the CPO just says, that's not, we're going to wait till someone else, beefs up security or fixes the problem they've got at the site, rather than them just being the kind of cash cow for it.
For sure. No, I completely agree with that. So let's swing to a more positive now.
Mm-hmm.
With the trip back, and looking out throughout the whole trip, I guess, what was your takeaway and what were the things like you would like to see? Maybe you can share some of the things that maybe surprise you positively, but then like, what were your takeaways? Like, hey, more canopies, or some of the things that your just takeaways, like this would make the EV driving experience a lot. It's not a huge change, but it would make it much better.
Well, I mean, the very fact that we're talking about it being incremental changes, small things, is positive, right? Because we've
For
been
sure.
hearing 18, 24 months that the charging networks are a disaster outside of the superchargers and you just can't travel. I mean, it was remarkably uneventful for, the vast majority of my trip. Sometimes there's gaps, sometimes there's, suboptimal placement, but that's just really a factor of, we're still building out networks. So that was a positive takeaway in itself.
No, that's a great
There's
point.
obviously things that you would want to improve. I mean, canopies and shelters are certainly valuable. I think in the desert, that's more just hot areas just to protect the equipment so that we don't have those reliability issues again. Because again, I think a lot of the positive experience that I had coincided with routes that Electrify America has either installed brand new equipment or just renovated the old stuff. So I think you want to protect that halfway. There's only so much life it's going to have in it, and you don't want that dying 2 or 3 years earlier and having the same problems we've seen over the last year or so. Um, on the positive side, I'd really like to see those down in Moab, just outside of Arches National Park, which is well worth a visit, for anyone who's going down there. There's recently been activated an Electrify America site with Rocky Mountain Power, so they have that commercial kind of agreement where the utility sets the pricing and the location, but the Electrify America is on the back end. That's right next to the entrance to the national park. I think there's a few of these. Electrify America has one near the Grand Canyon as well. I think Rivian is opening up a lot of charging outposts near to Yosemite, I want to say. So you're starting to see some of these more adventurous brands, or the utilities that serve the national park areas, putting charging right where the entrance to the parks are. That was really nice. It takes out all the thought of
Oh, for sure.
national parks. Some of them are really prone to driving. You really have to cover a lot of miles to get in and out of them. Not so much Arches, but Olympic, which I hit in Washington, was big and didn't really cover nearly enough of it.
Yeah, and I mean in Oregon, it's funny you mentioned that. The big one's Crater Lake, actually here, because it is kind of removed and it requires you to go over a mountain pass, especially if you're coming from I-5. And so, for anyone that wanted to go up, and then it's a decent drive up in elevation, so to go up
Right.
there and then to get back for a long time until really just maybe not even a month ago. Finally, there was a new V4 pull-through supercharger that opened, or I guess V3 plus, whatever you want to call it, but at
Mhm.
least made it open to more people, not just Teslas, to really make that kind of experience a lot greater. And I'm all for that. I think the national park partnerships that Rivian and others have done, I would love to see much more of that.
Yeah, and then probably, I mean, both would probably be the answer, but you can also mix in level two there. And
For sure, for sure.
Crescent, I think it was, in the center of Olympic, has a lodge there with a lot of hiking trails off it, and level two, complimentary level two. So I plugged in there for about 2.5 hours, got enough, charge so that I didn't have to fast charge on the kind of forks, outer roads where the Rivian and Tesla charges are. So you can, as long as your stay is not just drive, 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 as long as you're going to do something in that national park, which I hope most people want to do. Level two can play that role as well if it's at the visitor centres, if it's at the kind of hiking trailheads, that kind of thing. That can be really valuable. I think you probably need both because some people need the long stay, some people just literally want to drive it and head out again. So fast
Well,
charging.
yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think it is definitely a both thing because yeah, there are obviously, and I think it'd be great to see more people go hiking and stuff. But there are a lot of great like Zion and others that do have hikes that you can do there, but also great parts of that you drive through. That I think it's just good to see more people in general, especially if they're driving electric, visit national parks, have appreciation for nature. And I mean, another great example would be the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, which is phenomenal and highly recommend anyone that can go out there. But it is so essentially you have to be kind of coming through northern Arizona to hit it
Mhm.
because it is so remote and out of the way. But it's such a different and awesome experience. And that would be a great one to have level two at because, yeah, we drove back when we did that a few years ago in our Outback. And we drove for hours, at least a couple hours before we even got to Flagstaff, and through a good portion of that, there weren't even gas stations. It's just that remote. And that's, I think, what makes some of the best national parks or some of these monuments and stuff. And so I think at the very least, level two is required. But I think a lot of the time it's a bit of both.
And you can appreciate electric vehicles. I most appreciated them around the Badlands and kind of South Dakota because Sturgis is happening this month, and it was
Yeah,
just
yeah.
all the wall Harleys. And with all due respect, I think that's probably one of the last things that should be electrified. But when you're in the middle of a national park and the kind of striking, local scenery is there, and trying to enjoy that, and roaring thunder wave
Right.
obviously acts a little bit more jarring than it would be on the interstate.
No, completely agree with you on that too. Well, I realize we've kind of come up to the end of our time today, but I really appreciate you coming on, Steve, and sharing this. I guess to finally wrap up, is there any data? I know you shared a little bit at the beginning, but any data just to kind of, in conclusion, to share around the whole trip as far as miles and total chargers visited and stuff
Yeah.
like that?
So it's all headline figures at the moment. You did do me a service and forced me to kind of wrap the numbers as quickly as I could. So I hit 8,518 miles
Wow.
over the course of, I think it was 16 drive days. Now some of that's a little bit of bloat in terms of driving around the parks and not pure coast to coast, but solid kind of big trip. Obviously, 23 states. I think I said. 61 fast charging sessions. Some of that's
Wow.
doubled up, and there's videos to come on this because there's a lot of main videos for the road trip, and then there'll be the Starbucks versus Electrify America kind of stuff and stuff like that. So I did want to hit some other CPOs. And again, I need 5 level 2 charges, which was disappointing. Just, it's when you're away for 2 weeks and you can only charge level 2 effectively, that number of times.
Right.
Just really would have liked to see more hotels and kind of camping opportunities to hit that overnight charge. And as I say, we hit 2.9 miles per kilowatt hour, so it was not the best we've done in the Arctic. I think we got up to about 3.5, 3.6
Oh,
around
wow.
some of the flatter areas, all the slower roads. But then we were 80 miles an hour plus you're down to 2.3, 2.4, and it's sapping your
Yeah.
range. So that was a good, interesting mix of driving styles, I think. That's about all I've got in terms of stats. You can certainly kind of revisit the channel, and I'm getting these videos out as quickly as I can get. So hopefully I'll be at least one by the time this goes out.
Yeah, and I'm curious, do you have a rough ballpark? I know Electrify America, a lot of it was free, but do you have a rough ballpark for those ones that you did have to pay for what your kind of total trip came to?
We're only in low hundreds. I haven't totaled it all up yet.
Yeah, yeah.
I calculate out we're using just below 3,000 kilowatt hours. So if you times
Wow.
that out by what the going rate for fast charging is, somewhere between 40 and 50 cents, it's well over $1,000. So you start to get into gas territory there. But again, that's where the kind of level twos come in.
For
If you're getting
sure.
a free or cheap overnight charge, and you find certain places do have cheaper charging or free charging, you can start to really bring those costs down. But it's evident from looking at the way the prices are going that road trips in electric vehicles at the moment, unless you're on one of these plans or maybe on like superchargers, tend to be a bit cheaper. Certainly the Rivian Adventure network is a little bit cheaper. They're getting close to parity with gas. That's not really the strength of selling
Yeah,
EVs at the moment.
unfortunately,
And
yeah.
so if you're fast charging a lot, you're going to be paying almost gas prices.
Well, yeah, and there's even level twos I've had to use lately that charge anywhere from like 35 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which to
Yeah,
me is like, okay, now that's good.
starting,
That
pushing it
just
low.
annoys me. I understand they have to make some money, but yeah, that's just kind of getting upstairs. But no, I appreciate you sharing that with them. That's still impressive for the amount of miles and everywhere you covered with that. That's really great to see. Um, I know we'll have links like we did previously to your plug and play YouTube series and also the Coast to Coast EVs. I'm excited for the upcoming episode on September 11th, kind of discussing the current state of EV charging and some of the challenges around that. But
hopefully we can find some positive topics as well.
I'm sure we'll find some with that crew.
Yeah.
But is there any other upcoming events or other ways that people can kind of follow you and learn more about what you're working on right now, Steve?
LinkedIn's an increasingly good place. It's I can probably send you the link, but it's just Steve Birkett. I have a few projects on the way there. I'm trying to track the pricing of DC fast charging specifically, as we talked about across the country, and create a sample of the average prices month to month. Also pretty closely following the NEVI progress, or unfortunately lack thereof this summer. It's ground to a real halt, so they don't really have much to put in the monthly updates at the moment. But those are the kind of the things that I'm spotlighting and keeping my eye on at the moment.
Well, that's great. And I'll make sure to have links to that in today's show notes for people listening, so you can find more and follow Steve there. With that, Steve, thank you so much for coming on today, and we'll have to do this again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to share. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Grid Connections. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Steve Birkett from Plug and Play EV about his epic 8,500-mile road trip in an electric vehicle across the U.S. It's clear that the future of travel is electric, and hearing Steve's firsthand experiences gives us a glimpse into the exciting possibilities that lie ahead. As a reminder to those listening in the San Francisco Bay Area, I will be hosting the Amazon Recharge Zone at Electrify Expo in San Francisco this weekend, August 24th and 25th. If you'll be attending or in the Bay Area and want to meet up to talk about EVs or anything grid related, hit me up. You can either tweet at us or message on any of our social pages. Leave a comment on the YouTube page for this video, or email me at chase@connectingthegrid.com. That's chase@connectingthegrid.com. If you found this episode valuable, we'd love for you to share it with a friend or colleague who might enjoy it as well. And while you're at it, please take a moment to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback helps us continue to grow and deliver content that matters to you. Until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.